Monty, it's so nice to have you here today. We're really excited to delve into your work and to learn a little bit about your journey coming into anthropology and where you've really taken anthropology. But first, I suppose as a primer, let us know what the story was for you. Like, how did you become an anthropologist?
It's an interesting question that I think about a lot. And if I'm honest, I think there's something about growing up as a brown-skinned boy in a very white Australia and being not a very sort of hyper-masculine kind of boy in a very masculine world. I went to like an all-boys school, a very privileged all-boys school, and so I always felt like I was a little bit on the outer. And I often think about anthropology. I don't know where I read it once, but someone once said that anthropology is like, you know, when you're on a train trip or you're traveling through the countryside and you're always peering into the flickering lights in people's windows, right? Always wondering what's going on behind the curtains in other people's worlds. And that's sort of what it felt like for me growing up. I always felt like I was a little bit on the outer. Always felt like, you know, I didn't fully get it. That I never really fully felt like I was a part of it, and I was always wondering what life was like for people who did get it. And so I think that sort of set me up to having the sorts of dispositions required to be an anthropologist, which was, you know, what does it mean to be human? What is normal?
Yeah.
And so I spent, you know, a good portion of my life trying to work that out. But I think interestingly, I came to anthropology, I think, by mistake. Like I didn't even really know what it was when I was at university. I remember seeing it at a careers day, thinking, "Oh, that looks interesting. That's kind of cool." I remember doing it in biology and doing quite well, but then it was just about evolution. But I actually went to uni to study psychology in order to understand what it meant to be human, right? Psychology and philosophy, which interestingly is where I met Dr. Tim Dean, who will be a part of this series as well. And in my third year of university, third year of psychology, I was invited to be a diagnostic research assistant for the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurological Sciences in India. Right, and so it was all through my family. My family were all doctors, and so they had these connections. And so I was invited to go to these tribal areas, these areas in Wayanad, in the sort of the southern state of Kerala, very rich and diverse tribal population. And we were going to do this big sort of psychiatric or psychological diagnostic camp. And we would rock up to these places, these schools where they'd hold these camps, and we would meet these Indigenous people. And what's interesting is that in this particular area, there's a hierarchy of Indigenous people. And so there are Indigenous people who are landowners and Indigenous people who are slaves. And so we would do the work with the marginalised Indigenous people. And so these are people who've been dispersed and displaced and broken and bought and sold. And so coming together for these mental health camps was a really sort of social experience. Anyway, we'd rock up to these places and the National Institute of Mental Health would rock up with their big red book. They'd open the book and they'd kind of line up all these Indigenous people. They'd be like, you've got schizophrenia, you've got psychosis, you've got anxiety, you've got depression. It wasn't quite like that. But they would spend like maybe 5 minutes with each of them and then give them medication. And most of the time the medication would only last for a couple of weeks on the assumption that they'd get access to more medication, but they couldn't. And I was just sitting here going, this is not right. Like, I'm looking at these people, incredibly marginalised people, and what I'm seeing is not, you know, like the anxiety, the depression, the schizophrenia, the psychosis, the substance use. These are not the problem, they're the symptoms of a problem. And for me, the problem I thought was exclusion, inequality, marginalisation. And when I had an opportunity to speak with them through an interpreter, they were talking about it and they're like, you know, we love Western medicine. They had to align themselves with Western medical practices to sort of present an image of mobility and modernity. But they said, but, you know, to be completely honest, we have a different way of understanding this. And for us, you know, we understand sadness and anxiety and all that sort of stuff. For us, we use spirit possession. And my mind was blown. It was the first time that, like, my worldview had been completely pulled apart. And I was acutely aware of the fact, you know, if we are peering into those little windows, the flickering lights in the windows, that there is a completely different way of seeing and being in the world. and one that is incredibly valuable to this particular group of people. And it wasn't long after that I dropped out of psychology.
Of course.
I'd like to say the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow, that's so interesting. That's such an interesting experience. And it seems to be quite a common one that people come into anthropology by, they stumble upon anthropology and they feel that they see the gap. And evidently you saw the gap. Did you end up returning to the field, to India and continuing research, but as an anthropologist? What was the transition there?
So there's more to this story.
Yeah.
It's actually really important. It's a pivotal story. It's one that I tell quite regularly. It's interesting because I have an interesting relationship to this story. It's on that day when we were travelling, my mind had been blown. Like, I was 21, so I'd just read Siddhartha, Hermann Hesse's book about philosophy and stuff. And as a 21-year-old, I kind of thought I had it all sort of nailed. I understood it all. Anyway, we were on our way from this one particular camp to a village at the top of a mountain. And in order to get to that mountain, we had to cross a river. And in crossing the river, I think they were trying to G us up, but they basically said, look, there's crocodiles or alligators in the river. And so we were all nervous and scared anyway. We got to the other side of the river and all that adrenaline was sort of coursing through me. And it was just one of those moments where I just read Hermann Hesse. And if you haven't read it, he does talk about a river. It's pivotal in the story, right? And so I'm sitting by the side of this river, the edge of this river, watching it all flow by, just kind of taking it all in as a young 21-year-old whose worldview had just been opened up. And I'm like, wow, I just want to hold on to this moment forever, right? Yeah. And so I reached down and I picked up a stone and I popped that stone into my pocket. Anyway, we walked up the mountain to this village where we met an old village chief who said he was 120 years old, but he looked pretty old, right? He looked pretty old. He could have passed as 120. I don't know that he was 120, but what I do know is that the average lifespan of this particular community, the Pania, was 40 years old, and he was not 40 years old, right? And we're talking at this time, it was through interpreters because I hadn't yet learnt the language, but we were talking and in the middle of the conversation, he kind of reaches over to me and he points to my pocket and he says, "You've got something of mine," right? And so this is the thing, right? Incredible. Now I need to be really clear. I'm an atheist. I am a scientist. I'm fascinated by religion. I've studied it extensively, but that's just not the system I use to make sense of my experience, right? Yeah. And I have no explanation as to how he knew this, but I don't need to because it's still a meaningful experience. Anyway, he reaches to my pocket and he pulls out this stone and I'm feeling like I've made this massive cultural faux pas, on the cusp of being an anthropologist, and the first thing I've done is made a mistake, right? Yeah, stealing people's stones. Oh, it gets worse. And he says, look, the thing is, right, this stone is a part of us, it's a part of our community, it's a part of our land, and we're a part of it. And you actually can't take this without our permission, and you can't take it without taking the secrets that are embedded within it. And he's like, and I know, I've told this story a million times, I still feel the goosebumps, right? And he said, look, I like you, you seem nice. I'm going to let you take the stone, but you're not ready to hear those secrets yet. So what he did is he tied up the stone with some handmade twine, and he said when the twine unravels, the secrets will be revealed. And he gave it to me and I took it home and I've still got the stone. But years later, the stone unravelled, and that's a story for another occasion. But it inspired and motivated me to go back to that community and learn about their symbols, their structures, their practices, their rituals, to really connect with their stories and understand a little bit more about that stone, which I was very fortunate to be able to do as part of my PhD.
Wow, and seems like your first lesson in ethics,
right?
As well.
Absolutely.
And how did that feed into your PhD? Understanding this intersection of anthropology and ethics, and the interplay between the two.
Well, I think ethics is at the heart of anthropology. Or let me rephrase that. I think ethics is at the heart of ethnography. Yeah. For me, the ethnographic project is fundamentally an ethical project. It's about how can we become more aware of the assumptions and biases that we bring to the table How can we be aware of our position of power and how that affects the way that we are seeing and reading what is available to us in these cultural spaces? How is that affecting the relationships we have, the kind of information that will come to us because of those dynamics of power, because of those assumptions that we bring to the conversation? And look, and we can go on and on and on, but all the way through, from choosing the site to conducting the work in the site to how we view our relationships in the site. Are they respondents, participants, subjects, interlocutors, collaborators, in the field? And then, how do we ethically represent those stories? When we as ethnographers, we are claiming to tell stories on behalf of others, and there's a real responsibility that comes along with that. And so, it was an important first lesson, a very important first lesson. But also, when we situate ethics in relationships, it also helps caution against the idea that ethics is about a black and white concept of right or wrong, because I think that's problematic. And through the work that I did in my PhD, I was able to every day navigate the ethics of this engagement with the people I was working with, which was a real privilege and a real honour. And I hold that with a deep sense of responsibility.
So fascinating, Monty. And I'm really interested to understand, and I'm sure we'll be diving into it as we continue to dive into your research, but how have your understandings of ethics and negotiating ethics in ethnography changed throughout your career since that point?
Look, I think the beauty of ethics is that they have to change every day. Yeah. That's the point. Is that every single day we need to be asking those ethical questions, because every day is a new set of variables and circumstances and relationships. And I think like all early career academics, anthropologists maybe, I hated doing the ethics application. Everyone does, because they don't get it. It's all about psychology, and they don't really fully understand participant observation and deep hanging, right?
Totally.
And I always felt like because they didn't get it, it was too black and white, though it was an obstructive process, right? Yeah. And then years later, and I think part of that was immaturity. A big part of that was immaturity and being expected to do more work when all I really wanted to do was get out there and do the thing, which again, there are ethical issues there. But as I matured as an ethnographer and as a professional anthropologist and started to teach ethnography, really started to see the value of being able to reflect on and articulate the processes that we expect to go through as a way of unpacking those assumptions and expectations so that we can have a more equitable way and an inclusive way of interacting with people in the field without just rocking up and going, well, I want to study this, so I should be allowed to, and claiming that there's some kind of not just a right or an entitlement to do it, but that there's some sort of moral justification about doing this great work, on my terms. Yes. And so being forced to ask those ethical questions on a daily basis and to really sit with the complexity of what that means, that's the skill set, I think, that we develop as ethnographers. And it's a skill set that has to be continually tempered and calibrated by being in the field. I think when I do teach ethnography, and I can't claim this because I ripped it out of one of the readings that has been set in the courses, but ethnographers are both the instruments and the operators of ethnographic data collection. Yeah. And so we constantly have to calibrate our bodies as those instruments and constantly check our sort of subjective perspective, rather than check, embrace our subjective perspective as a part of that relationship and that process. And the act of doing that regularly is what gives us the ability to handle so much complex information and be able to process and analyse and to be able to try and see as many different perspectives as possible in real time. And it's that shaping of those embodied dispositions of ethics and ethnography that I think has been the most valuable resource I've used as I've taken those skills outside of academia and brought them into the corporate world or the social impact world.
It's so fascinating, Monty. And when we were speaking with Dr. Eve Vincent this morning. Wonderful Eve. And we were getting into this conversation really in such a similar vein as well, where, there was this sort of tension, this dissonance between the ways in which the ethics centres, well, not this ethics centres, but ethics committees at universities perceive ethics. And sometimes they do really see it in this very black and white. It's almost frozen in time, understanding of what is ethical and what is non-ethical. And anthropologists that are on the ground are seeing it in this more emergent way, where it's like an onion and it's so complicated and it's so complex, and we're likely going to leave off, 20 to 30% of what could be an ethical issue in our applications, because how would we know? How would we get out onto the field and things emerge constantly? And so it's this really interesting interplay of when we're working with these structures that can still be quite stagnant in time and place, but then the anthropologist is very emergent and working with people on a daily basis. Like, has that been something that you've had to negotiate through your career at all, or?
Well, I mean, I think whenever I wrote an undergraduate degree or an undergraduate essay, I always used to have the line, "It's complicated." And then when I started marking undergraduate essays, I was like triggered when everyone said it was complicated, because I think it can very easily be a throwaway line.
Yeah.
And that is not to take away from the fact that complexity exists, right? And I suppose when it comes to navigating these tensions or this dissonance, like I'm a jazz musician, so I don't shy away from the dissonance.
Yeah.
I think that there's something really rich in that space. It's in that dissonance where we have an opportunity to uncover new themes and variations, and that's extending both a musical metaphor as well as a theoretical one, right? I have tended to want to sit in those spaces a little bit more, and to varying levels of success. But I think the fact that I've sat in those spaces and sat with the complexity and sat with the dissonance has forced me to learn how to articulate the complexity in ways that aren't just paying it off.
Yep. Yeah.
It's just too complex, or it's too hard to understand, or, which is actually quite a natural, normal place to be when you're still working it out, right? And that's important. But also recognizing that, I'm engaging with people who need to understand, who have got a whole heap of things at stake here, when they are potentially sending you off to do this work, right? Whether that be money or reputation, or more importantly, the safety of participants, for example, the safety of community members. And so, navigating that by not centering my work is really important. As an ethnographer and as an academic or as an anthropologist, I think as an immature anthropologist, I would center my work, telling everybody about all my stuff, right? But as I grew, it was less about centering my stuff and more about trying to really understand where others were coming from, and trying to be a bit more generous in how I communicated, recognizing that the words that I use can create boundaries of exclusion and privilege and power that can be discursively used to create hierarchies that I don't think necessarily work in the favour of the kind of stuff I'm trying to do.
Do you think that anthropologists are well placed to begin to start to see second and third order effects of ethical considerations that have not yet emerged?
I think we already are. I'm in the Defence Force, I'm in the Australian Army, and I'm an executive officer of an infantry company, so pretty army. But I'm privileged in that I get to work in a number of other spaces, the intelligence space and the CIMIC space. Yeah. The CIMIC space is the civil military cooperation space. So, humanitarian aid, disaster relief, post-conflict rehabilitation, where the aim is to really stimulate host nation primacy rather than dependency models, for example.
Yes, yeah.
There's a lot of stuff in the military around red teaming, or being able to see things from the perspective of others. And in the doctrine, it's think like an anthropologist, right? And a big part of it is being able to anticipate, to plan for effects, and be able to anticipate and even design for second, third order effects, and see how they affect the impact it will have in an operating environment. And I think there is this sort of mythical superpower that people like to attribute to that. You know, people love to say, "Oh, we've got this predictive capability, clairvoyant capability," and I'm like big on demystifying that. Really big on demystifying that, because for me, it's a specific methodological practice. Right, it's a specific methodological practice, and you know, even Gillian Tett's book, Anthrovision, and the silo effect, and you know, she was wildly applauded as being, you know, an anthropologist who works for the Financial Times who is able to predict the global financial crisis, right? And you know, she talks about the anthrovision as about being able to have a worm's eye view and a bird's eye view and oscillating between the two, so that we can see the patterns emerging. And you know, it gives us the quality of being able to see around corners, and I think we have to be careful about that. I think there is a real benefit to helping people see the power of anthropology, but there's a risk with promising that we have these special powers. What I do know is that the more I'm able to like marshal the diverse data sets, you know, that are not just about the quantifiable, but you know, the interactive, the symbolic, you know, the rituals, the structures of meaning that lie beneath them, right? The way in which meaning is not just placed in human bodies, but in our environment and our relationship to the environment. We're able to marshal a whole range of data points that we can use, and because we have been trained to be these instruments and operators of ethnographic data collection, we can process it in real time. And what that means is with practice and dedication and time and discipline, that our ability to provide analyses, it just gets quicker. But I don't think we're predictive, we're responsive, incredibly responsive. But the faster our response time, the more predictive it appears. And the more quality, robust data we can accumulate and sit with, this is why the complexity is so important. The more we can sit with the complexity of all those different things and be able to hold it, the more able we are to then provide an analysis that may appear predictive, but is actually just, I think, robust and comprehensive, responsive, and has validity precisely because it doesn't have that tunnel vision.
That's so fascinating. And we need an economy that fosters time. Well, it provides enough time to sit in that complexity. It seems like, you know, far too often in our society, we're so eager to sort of get on our moral high horse and say, oh no, it's got to be this or it's got to be that, and you've only got this amount of time to come to those conclusions. Before we jump into how you've used creativity to attract, you know, to promote anthropology and to do your work with broader audiences and communities, I do want to ask you, like, what has your experience being an anthropologist, but also having involvement with the military, navigating the ethical considerations in that space?
Look, it's a really important question because, you know, when I first announced that I was joining the army, I copped a lot of flack from many anthropological friends, and part of it was, you know, how could you do that, right? And one of the things I love about anthropology is that it acknowledges that we have complex subjectivities. I grew up I went to a military school. I had my father was a lieutenant colonel in the army. When I was a teenager, I was vehemently against the military. And then as part of my own journey of like trying to work out what it meant to be Australian and what it meant to be a man, I joined the army in my 20s. And at the time, it was an awful place to be. If you were brown-skinned, not hyper-masculine, and also, like at the time, it was not a great place to be. I had a strong social conscience, and for me, it was all about, like I had a really strong drive towards inclusivity. So I didn't last very long. It was not long after I joined. I think I was in for a couple of years, but I had the opportunity to then travel and that sort of set me on the path towards this anthropological career. And so I always wanted to go back because whilst there were some really awful aspects of it at the time, I loved some of the aspects of it, like the ability to overcome challenges through teamwork, which is something that, I wasn't sporty at school. I didn't understand what it was like to be part of a team. I never felt like I was fully a part of something, as I said before. And so being a part of something and being able to overcome like the fear or the limiting beliefs I thought around what my body could and couldn't do, it was amazing.
Yeah.
And even then, at the time, I was noticing that it was aspects of the culture and the social organisation and the rituals and the practices and the symbols that they used and the relationships that they had that enabled humans to do amazing things, right? And as I got older, I was like, wow, that's anthropology, right? Like the great, the great migrations out of Africa or the great mariner routes into the South Pacific or into the Americas, right? Like that is... If we were to do that today, we probably wouldn't be able to do that in the same way. But what did they have? They didn't have the sort of material technologies. They had the technology of culture that supported them to be able to do that, right? So I was fascinated by that. Anyway, as I was coming towards, I finished my PhD actually. And I always wanted to go back to the army and finish what I'd begun, but it was just, PhD, kids. And then all of a sudden I was 40, right? Yeah. And I was contemplating, that was around the time when I was contemplating leaving academia. And I was looking at all of my different options. And it was at that time that General David Morrison had that speech, "The standard you walk past is the standard you accept," which was on the back of all those awful things, all the scandals involving, gender-based violence, sex scandals, etc., and exclusion. And so I was in my kind of naive, self-righteous way. I was like, well, I can do something about this. I'm going to join the army and I'm going to show them how to do it, right? Yeah. And so I did. I joined the army and I thought I'm going to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I got into the army and I very quickly discovered that, yes, there were people who were philosophically, ideologically opposed to me, but there were actually a lot of people who were like-minded.
Yeah.
And they were drawn to the army for different reasons, for service, for belonging, a sense of nationalism that I didn't realise existed as well in Australia, which I found quite interesting. Yeah. So I got there and I realised actually, not only were there a lot of like-minded people, there were a lot of very different people. But what I worked out was that we could achieve amazing things because the humans are capable of amazing things.
Totally.
If we leverage the superpower of our humanity and the superpower of our diversity. Because we were able to achieve amazing things, not in spite of our differences, but precisely because of them. And so that was like an eye-opening moment for me where I was like, wow. And so I can work alongside people and we are open about how we disagree about things.
Yeah.
We are open about the things that we disagree with. But we can still achieve amazing things together. And for me, that's a powerful metaphor that I think speaks to our humanity.
Totally.
And it's something that I think we need more of. I'm not here to kind of, wave the flag of the Australian Defence Force. That's not my role in this space right now. But it is to remind people that, we can have biases around academia and anthropology and, the arts and simultaneously accuse people who differ to us as having these stereotypes and biases that are one-sided.
So you were saying that the stones had some real meaning around memory and...
So interestingly, so I went back to this particular community, the Punya community. The name Punya literally means labourer, and that's because they were slaves. So they were, and while slavery was abolished in the 1800s, it continued under the guise of indentured labour. It still continues to this day. And so, had the opportunity to go back and to really to try and understand their spirit possession rituals, their rituals of healing, their rituals of death and initiation, their stories, their songs, their symbols, right? And one of the things that I found, I spent 18 months there over a 3-year period. It was an incredibly profound experience. It was where my embodied ethnographic tool was sharpened or forged, if you will, and then sharpened. I had the privilege of having my family there. My son was there when he was 6 months old, which was incredible. But one thing I learned was that when someone dies, it's believed that the spirit goes out into nature and then comes back into the world of the living in the form of a stone.
Wow.
Right? So those stones, these penna stones, penna means corpse or body, is the body of the ancestor, of the deceased ancestor. It's not a symbol, it is the ancestor. And contained within that stone is the story of the ancestor. So, where they went, who they met, what they learnt, how they behaved, the things, the acts of bravery, the acts of cowardice, the mistakes that they made, right? What they discovered along the way. And so these stones, because this is a community that is excluded from education, from politics, from society, they don't have phones or books. They're not literate, right? They don't have computers or photographs. Yeah. They have these stones, and these stones are a rich repository of information. Now, for particularly important ancestors, those stones are permanently situated in locations all around the region, right? So the stone becomes synonymous with the ancestor's story, what they've learned, how they lived, who they were, who they met, where they went, but also the location. So that can include, how their story is connected to discovering potable water, medicinal plants, poisonous plants, food to eat, spiritual territorial boundaries. Wow. And so, the stone and the story and the location are all wrapped up. Yeah. And so as you're moving through the landscape, you're actually constantly telling the story of your ancestors and constantly telling the story of your community and your culture about how to live, things that people do that is a life lived well, how not to live, things that people shouldn't have done. Yeah. And so by moving around the space, you are constantly reliving the story of this community. And what happens when someone dies is that they actually tell the story of the community from the moment of creation right to the moment of the most recently deceased. And it's a really long story. It takes 3 days, the Penapartum, or the body song, the corpse song, the death song. It takes 3 days to recite, and nobody ever learns it. Nobody's ever taught it, but everybody knows it, right? Wow. Because this simple act of moving through space and making sense of our experience through our interaction with these objects, these stories, these symbols, these practices, these relationships, it kind of embeds that cultural knowledge, and it doesn't have to be explicitly spoken about because it's implicitly experienced as a way of being.
That's so beautiful.
And it's really incredible, right? Because on the basis of doing that work, I was able to look at a number of other cultures who do similar things, like the Lukasa memory boards in Zambia, for example. They have these boards with beads, and they can run their fingers over these beads, and they can recite like encyclopedic canons of knowledge through these stories, right? These mnemonic devices. Or Lynn Kelly wrote a great book called The Memory Code, where she talks about rituals in Australian Indigenous cultures, also Stonehenge, building on this idea of the Greek method of Loki, where they would, use space to remember things, right? So using sort of like spatial mnemonics, the example I give is that if you're in your kitchen and you're studying, you can put like different sort of knowledge bombs on the microwave, on the oven, on the fridge, and then all you have to do is imagine you're in your kitchen and look around it, and you think about the fridge, and you can connect with the knowledge bomb, right? So you're using a really powerful method to illustratively and kind of remember things. And so, this particular ritual that the Pania used was a powerful invocation of history, genealogy, ancestry, topography, cultural instruction, ecology, all wrapped up in their symbols, their structures, their practices, all wrapped up in their culture. And it enabled them to experience, process, store, and recall vast amounts of information. Not because they had computers, but because they cognitively offloaded all that information. The human brain can only hold like maybe 4 or 5 things for 20 seconds. Yeah. And then we have to do stuff to it. And what they did to it was that they would cognitively offload, create these cognitive ecologies of memory. And so like Eve would have done lots of this stuff in her work with Indigenous communities, I'm sure. But how our relationship to the environment, our relationship to each other, our relationship to our rituals and our stories and our symbols are not just fancy things that we use like mission, vision, value statements to kind of drive our corporate culture. They are deeply human things, deeply human technologies that we need to be able to make sense of our world in efficiently. It's a technology that enables us to remember. I mean, I know when I drive past around my mum, where I grew up with my mum, I think of the place where I had a first kiss, for example, and the whole story comes back.
Yes.
Right. So my memory of my story is deeply connected to place.
Yeah.
Things that I will never think about, they come back to my memory when we're sharing stories with friends, or when I get the smell of something that reminds me of that moment, or I taste something that reminds me of that moment. And so that idea that you know, like knowledge and wisdom and experience is not contained into these individual minds and bodies of sort of, you know, individual people, but it's actually it's distributed through our relationships and through our cultures, and also in our environment, is an incredibly powerful vehicle that I've been able to use to help people understand culture.
That's so fascinating. I mean, if we had more time, I would love to, you know, we could dive into Carl Jung's collective unconscious theory, you know, the theory of the collective unconsciousness. And it's just so fascinating how, you know, ideas of psychology are coming back that sort of were grounded. But, you know, what I love about anthropology so much is that it makes the strange, the unknown, the complex, the uncertain more familiar, and vice versa. And I think that, you know, even just now sitting with you and talking about your career so far, and there's still so much we haven't even touched on, it seems like, you know, you've really got an appetite for complexity and sitting with that and understanding what we still don't understand, you know, whether it's understanding the psychology and the culture of memory and understanding the collective cultural practices around how do we store that and create these, you know, tens of thousands of year-long archives, or whether it's even just sitting with the complexity of today and navigating that. And I know that you're a jazz musician, and even just within jazz, and I'm not a musician myself, but, you know, jazz is complex.
Yeah, I love it.
And you know, it's just fantastic. And you're a storyteller, and you tap into all these beautiful creative outlets to tell the story, to tell your story of anthropology, and to tell your experiences of your work to date, and to bring people together. So I'd love to ask you how you do this so effectively, of using creative methods to sort of, like tap into the collective.
Yeah, I mean, look, we probably should start with a disclaimer that I perhaps don't agree with Jung's concept of
I don't think many people do.
Universal archetypes. As a bit of a post-structuralist. I was raised as an academic, or academically, my pedigree is, you know, post-colonial feminist Marxism with a strong post-structuralist kind of vein in it. So,
not a Freud man?
Not a Freud man, not at all. I really owe a lot to my supervisor, Kalpana Ram, who really nurtured me for many years, and her husband, the late Ian Bedford. Wonderful, wonderful people. But I think, you know, it sort of sounds like I'm really clever and there's agency involved, but the reality is, like, I'm just a human being who likes to tell stories and play games.
Yeah.
And I was privileged enough to have an education where I learnt about anthropology and the value of storytelling, of play, of ritual theatre, ritual drama, of human interaction, and was able to provide some fancy words to justify telling stories and playing games. But, you know, also acknowledging that they're incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Right? So I started working actually again around the same time that I was looking at joining the army again, and I was like, what do I do? I don't know that I can be an academic. At the time, it was like I was looking at what was involved, and I didn't think that I was prepared to pay the price. And we mentioned before that came along with a whole range of feelings of guilt and shame that I'd failed as an anthropologist, or as an academic. And so I was desperately exploring, you know, during this moment of crisis, what else could I do? And I have a long history of youth work and community development, working with young people And so and at the time I decided, all right, I'm going to start exploring options. I became an ethics teacher in primary schools and worked with young kids, and was like, well, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could start doing more stuff, like some anthropological stuff with them, so it wasn't so weird and new when they got to university. And so in order to make things accessible to them, we had, like, and I was working with kindies through to primary school, and we were running, you know, I ended up getting a job as the school mentor, working on emotional intelligence, team building, social skills with young kids. Then you have to be creative, because you can't be deeply pedagogical, right? You, as soon as you start to tell people what to do, they've already shut off.
It's not going to fly.
Not going to fly. So I had to learn these deeply creative processes, and all I did was I tapped into my inner child, which is really not that far from the surface, and just played games, told stories, sung songs. We'd use beatboxing and, you know, a cappella as a vehicle to demonstrate, to create social connections, but also understand emotional intelligence. Yeah. We did a whole big program where these young people would write their own songs about their inquiry unit, you know, and they were learning about social skills at the same time. And so it was really good training, because then when I got to, and I was like, well, I've got to do these in the high schools, and started working with high school students, and they're really tough, right? Like, especially year 9 high school students.
Oh yeah.
So like they start from a default position of, oh, you're just really lame. So I had to really double down on these skills and you know, and really level up the playfulness, and almost be a fool to go, well, hey, yes, I am an idiot, but I'm going to give you permission to be a bit of an idiot too. And so I think it was in those spaces. And then what happened, interestingly, is that I started working in the education space. So I was lecturing in you know, the sociology of education, research methods, and educational psychology. And so I was able to start to formalise these ideas and these practices by drawing on, you know, pedagogical practice and educational methods and theories to go, well, actually, the playing of the games and the telling of the stories, you're actually doing stuff.
Yes, yeah.
So it gave me a real confidence to start exploring that in more depth. And, you know, Habitus is a social enterprise. It was always designed to be for the benefit of schools, communities, and families in need. And so, you know, it was all about working with those primary school kids, those high school kids, and then realising, well, actually, we need to work with their parents. And then realising, well, those parents work in organisations, we've got to work with those organisations too. Yeah. But all built around this idea of, you know, how can we just embrace our humanity and be more human?
Yep.
And so, you know, I learnt those skills, those skills of creativity and playfulness and storytelling. I think they were there anyway, but I really refined those skills through my passion for that work, and the fact that I had the time and space to practice them in really harsh environments. Yeah. I say that if you can work with kindies, Year 9 boys, and CEOs, you can work with anyone. And in doing so, it's funny because, like, I will get, like, really serious people like, I don't like doing it. By the end of it, they're like, I love this, because, you know, they've been given permission to tap into their humanity. Yeah. You know, and we even tie that into your, like, you know, your performance of self in public places, or symbolic interactionism. Yes. The masks that they feel they have to wear. This aligns with the work we do with gender as well as, you know, race and privilege. But we help them see that you know, we wear certain masks. They may not have been ones that we've chosen. They may have been put upon us, but they affect the way that we interact with each other. And with these masks, we can actually reproduce the status quo. But when we take off the masks, we're as messy as all hell. Yeah. And that's that messiness, when the fissures behind the curtain, behind the perfection of those masks that we're trying to maintain, that's where there's that generative quality of where our interactions can produce these creative potentials that we never even imagined. Yeah. And so we don't talk about it. Yep. We do it. We don't tell them the things, we do the things. It's deeply experiential. And then we get them to reflect on it. And that act of reflection is a deeply cultural process, right? And by reflecting on it, they create the meanings. It's incredible. You don't need to talk about Foucault or Goffman or Dussertot, or I love them, they're amazing. You just need to give people a space where they feel free to. And it becomes a provocation, and by simply unpacking their human experience, they come up with these words and ideas on their terms. Yeah. And for me, like, you know, I double down on that because I think that's an ethical act.
Yeah.
You know, obviously we guide and we support and we facilitate and we nurture that experience. But if I'm there telling them what it's all about, then I own that narrative and I'm engaging in that discursive practice.
Sure.
But if they aren't, own the narrative, if they're making those connections between ideas and experiences and using that to make sense of their own lived experience, then they own that narrative. And that's a method that it cuts through, whether we're doing programs at schools or whether we're doing corporate team building programs or whether we're doing leadership programs or whether we're doing some of our other stuff, which is around big culture change programs.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. You're incredible. I mean, Monty, I have been following your work at Habitus for a little while now, and I'd love to learn more about how you came to initiate Habitus and what Habitus is sort of aiming to foster in society.
Yeah. So how did I initiate Habitus? I was a crisis, and I knew in the core of my being that I was an anthropologist. I knew it. That's the only thing I knew. But I also knew that I couldn't be an anthropologist in the way that I thought I was going to be in academia.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to work out how was I going to do it. And so it was actually like a good 6 months of deep crisis.
Yeah.
What am I doing? And I had to really work out who was I, what really mattered. Yeah. You know, what do I want to do? What do I enjoy? And it was messy. Habitus was messy to begin with. We were running rites of passage camps. We were running for teens and their dads. We were running father and child camps. We were doing gender things. We were doing corporate things. It was all over the place. And we were not making any money because all I wanted to do was, it was almost like this deep period of kind of exploring and iterating and discovering what it was. Yeah. But also trying to leverage the things that I loved and the things that I was good at and try to make them viable in a space. And so we threw a lot of things out there and a lot of things were amazing. They just weren't viable.
Yeah.
And so in the beginning, it was going to be a purely social thing, but we couldn't do it. And I kept taking money out of our kind of savings and my wife kept getting grumpy and, then COVID came and it was even worse. And so what we did was we recognised that the work is good. We also recognised that the work is incredibly flexible. That each of our programs, because it is connected to what it means to be human. Yeah. And it draws on those deep drives for human connection. Yeah. And exploration. Yes. And meaning making. And so we use them in all the different spaces. So interestingly, the same programs we would use in kindergarten and high school, we were also using with CEOs in one of the big fours, or leadership training in one of the group of 8 universities, for example. Same programs work because we're still humans all the way through. And so, for me, that's when the real kind of vision of Habitus was really being formed, and it was about making anthropology a household name, helping people understand the value of anthropology, not just for big sticky problems, but for little everyday problems. Recognising that I used anthropology to make sense of that moment of crisis when I was trying to work out who I was. And I use anthropology and anthropological methods and techniques and to be able to support communities to make sense of their complex issues and sit with complexity and not seek to resolve everything, not to have a community of consensus, but a community of inquiry where we can just collectively make sense of those complex experiences together and create multivocal spaces where we are aware of our positions of power so that we don't dominate those narratives and only have one version of that story come out, but actually see what's possible when we can allow those different stories to coexist and actually have a bit of epistemic justice where we're actively pulling out the ones that are rendered invisible or silenced or pushed to the sides, or the ones who don't feel that they're allowed to contribute, right? And so it was all about, helping people see the value of anthropology and, by definition, the value of our humanity. Centering our humanity is the most important resource we have to achieve amazing things. And it's been I've loved it. It's been an incredible journey because, we help organisations realise that you don't need management consultants or buzzwords deal with these things. And mission, vision, value statements, they're great, but that's not how culture is formed, right? It's through our everyday interactions, how we treat each other.
Yeah.
The symbols, the structures, the practices that we have around us. And how can we marshal those symbol structures and practices to be more inclusive and collaborative? All the buzzwords of innovation and resilience and all that sort of stuff. I'm like, hey, guess what? They go, how can we be more innovative and collaborative and adaptable in a VUCA world, volatile, unstable, complex and ambiguous. And some people are calling it BANI now. What is it? Brittle, anxious, non-linear and incomprehensible. I'm like, oh my gosh.
We need another jargon.
We need another jargon. And I'm like, okay, let's look at the long history of human evolution and the long story of what it means to be humans. We have always lived in a volatile, unstable, complex, ambiguous, brittle, anxious, non-linear, incomprehensible world. And we have always been able to deal with it precisely because humans are adaptable. We're innovative, we're collaborative, we communicate, we connect with each other. We have these things. We don't need another 12-step program or a bloody, you know what I mean? We just need to connect with what it means to be human and provide the structures so that we can safely have different versions of that humanity come out.
Yeah.
So that we don't get caught in the epistemic bubble of there is only one way of doing or seeing things.
Yeah.
That we're actually openly welcoming those diverse perspectives, to leverage the wisdom of the people around us so that we can challenge the assumptions that we bring into this table, so that we can, create the conditions for healthy conflict. Healthy cultures have healthy conflict. There is always contestation, right? We need that. And a big part of that is also embracing the fact that humans are not perfect.
Yeah.
And that's actually really important.
Totally.
We are not perfectly adapted to anything. That's actually our superpower. Because we are not perfectly adapted, we have to be variable and adaptive, and so it's within those imperfections, because we're imperfect, we need people and other, communities. Because we have communities, we have cultures, and that is the secret to our adaptive success as a species, our imperfection. So let's really leverage that and value that. And it just releases for a lot of organisations for them to go, we don't have to get it right all the time. We don't have to know all the answers. What we do need to have is each other. And that's been a really powerful thing. That's at the heart of what drives Habitus. And I think where I'm really fortunate and where I'm really grateful is that we've reached a level of sort of economic viability. So we're not taking money out of the savings anymore.
Just tell me your secrets, Monty.
Well, I don't. Hard work. And honestly, caring enough to do it, with integrity. And what I've found is that that's attracted really amazing. I can't say that I've done this on my own. I always talk about all the people that have supported me, including, Tim Dean, he's been a really strong supporter and a friend. He does stuff with us at Habitus. All the people that I work with at the moment are incredible people. We've been drawn together because we all have a similar value for humanity and what it means to be human. And that's what kind of, the more people that come in, the more successful we are, because it's not about me. It's never been about me. And that's what I love. And so, we're now at a stage where we can give away a lot of stuff to communities that need it. We leverage the profits that we make. The profit, we don't consider ourselves a success because of profits or shareholders. We consider ourselves a success because of how much good work we can do for communities and schools and people that need it. And we get to do a lot of that. So I'm very, very proud.
And you're doing such incredible work, specifically exploring this concept of toxic masculinity. Really, really love to delve into that exploration with you, because, it's pretty interesting to see that it might have been this evolution for you, like you were saying before, your experiences growing up, going to an all-boys school, then going to the army, never feeling like you quite fit in because you didn't consider yourself to be, the stock standard male figure. And then you were doing rites of passage camps with sons and their fathers. Do you feel that this was like an evolution for you, something that you were always really interested to explore?
Yeah, definitely. And it did open me up to a whole world of a lot of this masculinity work, and not all of it is great, right? And so I had to start navigating, well, what was the stuff that was reproducing certain essentialist norms of masculinity, and what was the stuff that was actually opening it up? Yeah. And for me, like, masculinity was a big one. I believe that we needed to, and certainly on the back of Me Too, we needed to have these conversations, but what was happening is that people weren't talking, and it was actually pushing us further apart.
Yeah, totally.
So how could we create a space where people were not, where it wasn't about being politically correct? Because I actually think that's a bit of a transactional approach, right? That there is no right or wrong, because who defines what's right or wrong? What scope does that have for complexity or nuance? Yeah. What I prefer is an empathetic approach, which is much more transformative. And for us to get to that space, we needed people to feel like they could talk about the stuff with it and recognise that they might make mistakes along the way, and that's an important part of it. Yep. And that in fact, making those mistakes is the very vehicle through which they can work out how they feel and work out what's important to them, but not in isolation. That was the risk, that they were trying to work out what it meant to be a man, but in isolation from women and trans people and men who don't conform to the stereotypical ideal of what it meant to be a man. And that was dangerous. That was toxic. So how do we open up those spaces without placing the emotional labour onto the shoulders of the marginalised, or on women to keep telling those stories, but actually get men telling their stories of challenge and struggle? And so one of the things about our programs, our masculinity programs, is that we offer people an opportunity to take their masks off and to see that, you know, the status quo that we're reproducing because we have this assumption that a man should be like this can actually be can be challenged. And what we also discovered was when we worked with these young boys and these men from all ages, they were all kind of walking around with this mask thinking, you know, like, everybody else is like this, so I have to be like this. And once we took the mask off, they realised actually there is so much complexity and there is so much nuance behind the mask. And what's behind the mask, there's so much more behind the mask than what's in front of the mask. And so it gave people an opportunity to challenge this rigid construct of what they felt they should be because of the mask of masculinity, or what has been called the man box, these specific behaviours that you know, we are led to believe are necessary for us to be successful men, right? Yeah. And it gave us an opportunity to have those big conversations in a space where people could make mistakes, where people could disagree respectfully for the sake of learning and growing. And you know, a great place for men to unpack these things, but not in isolation from women. Yeah. So, you know, really important in these programs is that we get men speaking to other men, speaking to women, speaking to people, to trans people, to non-binary people, and allowing that meaning-making process of the essentialist ideas of gender to be opened up so that they have options. And they don't all have to agree. Yeah. They just also have to recognise that, you know, that there is not only one way of being a man. And if you're rigidly trying to enforce one way, which ironically is always out of reach of all men, then that's when it becomes toxic. There's nothing wrong with being masculine or macho or physically strong. There's also nothing wrong with being the opposite. Yeah. By the same token, whether you define masculinity in traditional terms or necessarily alternative terms, you're still defining masculinity. Yeah. And it still puts it in a box, just a different box. Yeah. So what scope do we have to navigate and negotiate our own gender and subjectivity on our own terms? And you know, that a big part of that is storytelling and playing games to get people to feel safe. And additionally, what's really important is that we don't, you know, make the storytelling, or we don't place the weight of emotional labour on the shoulders of the marginalised, whether they be women or trans people or non-binary people, but we actually get men sharing their stories. And we found that to be a really powerful tool to get people to connect as humans. Yeah. We have a saying in Habitus, we connect through stories, we learn through play. So we use stories all the time. Yeah. You know, they build empathy and trust. And sharing those stories really opens people up. And you know, when we do our programs, you know, I'm always very, very clear, we're not going to solve this problem. That's not the point. We are going to have a brave conversation. And this applies to whether we're dealing with race or gender or cancel culture or, you know, cultural humility or any of the other stuff that we deal with. And we start with this premise that if we can just own our privilege and bias, if we can connect with each other empathetically, then we can make a choice. And more often than not, people choose the right thing, or people make good choices because they're connected to humanity rather than some sort of abstract idea of right or wrong with social pressure or social isolation as a punitive kind of effect of breaking the status quo.
Yeah.
And we found that to be a really, really valuable tool in all the work that we do.
And you've been doing some incredible work with Tim Dean, one of your good colleagues. A little while ago, you produced the Meaning of ... podcast,
Yes.
and you did touch on cancel culture.
Yeah.
I personally found this to be such an enlightening conversation, and I just thought it was. I think it's an important place for anthropologists to be positioned, because we do like the complex, and we are good at sitting with complexity. And I'd love to hear, your thoughts on like why that topic arose between you and Tim, why you felt that it was an important one to discuss.
Yeah, look, I think I have to give a bit of background on Tim and our conversation.
Yeah.
So what people don't realise is that the podcast that we did is actually just Tim and me. That is literally, if I was to pick up the phone to Tim,
I love that.
that's what happened.
That.
Now, we would hang out and, with our partners, they would just hear us talking. They'd be like, you've either got to get a room or do a podcast. And we're like, all right. So we got a podcast. And literally what we do is we just talk.
Yeah.
And I love that Tim comes from a philosophical perspective. I come from that more deep, sort of ethnographic, embodied, lived experience perspective. And we agree on a lot of stuff. We just come at it from different perspectives. And it was an important conversation to have, I think, because navigating these questions of political correctness and free speech, and how with shifts in technology and media, the landscape has changed to the point where we've got these false binaries of perspectives that are actually reinforcing those epistemic bubbles or echo chambers, which and that division is what fuels the economic and technological machine.
Yeah.
And so there is a vested interest to keeping us separate. Yet the amount of people that were actually represented by those extremes was quite small. The more people I spoke to, there were more people in the grey, but when forced to make to align themselves, they would align with the one that felt more comfortable, right?
Yeah.
Whether they believed in it or not.
Yeah.
And or the one that they were used to, or the one that their friends were involved in.
Yeah.
And so it was really important to start unpacking some of this complexity and to explore, what even is cancel culture, right? I don't even believe it. I don't think it's effective because you can't actually cancel anyone. Right? And I say this, most of the people that claim to be cancelled are still telling everybody how they're getting cancelled from these platforms that clearly demonstrate that they're not being cancelled. If cancel culture was actually a thing, then Donald Trump would have been cancelled. And he hasn't been, because no one can actually stop you from saying or thinking whatever you want. No one can do that.
Yeah.
We haven't got a place to do that. And you can, certainly there are issues of violence and threat and hate speech.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the stuff that people have anxiety over with regards to cancel culture doesn't fall into that category.
Yeah.
It's about how do we navigate cultural difference, or how do we navigate political difference?
Yeah.
And so, one, I don't think cancel culture exists. I think it's a thing that is used. It's like a dog whistle to kind of lament the loss of free speech, which, I don't know, I feel like we've got some pretty free speech out there, But I also think that there are, because the proliferation of a lot of these kind of cancel culture tropes are so quick, and people want to be good.
Yeah.
And so when there's a thing on social media that says that this is bad, they're like, well, I don't want to be bad, so I can't do that.
Yeah.
You can't say this, you can't say that, you can't. And what happens is that it's genuinely shutting down dialogue, but more importantly, it's shutting down a critical assessment of what is right or wrong for us in a given moment in time, which will change.
Yeah.
Because my daughter's always asked me, can I say this? Can I not say that? I'm like, well, I don't know, darling. We've got to work it out.
Yeah.
But we're not going to work it out in isolation. I'm married. My wife is white, and her family's from Austria. And my kids, like my daughter identifies as a person of colour and my son doesn't.
Yeah.
So who's a person of colour?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then now when in India,
So
right, in order for my family in India to understand us, we have to speak in an Indian accent.
Yeah.
Right? So is that wrong? Right?
Yeah.
That I'm speaking an Indian accent and my kids who are white passing speak in an Indian accent, and yet when our family comes they have to. So it's like, I mean, this is a very, very, it's a very, it's a visible way of saying it's complex. You know, I know I poo-pooed the idea of saying it's complex, but the reality is there is not a simple solution here.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when we have a black and white approach to this is right or that is wrong, political correctness has that black and white approach, but it's also coupled with these really strong punitive coercive forces to keep people in line, while simultaneously having people who are resisting, who are kind of almost taking on cancel culture as a vehicle to go, well, I'm just going to say whatever I want. You have this very destructive set of ingredients.
Yeah.
And we know that in organisations where there is a strong perception of cancel culture, the people that are doing the cancelling, well, they don't feel like there's any agency because no one actually gets cancelled. The people that are getting cancelled are publicly shamed. There's no room for making mistakes. There's not a lot of room for sort of forgiveness. And it can have massive effects on their self-esteem and their psychological well-being, right? Like I have made, as an anthropologist, I don't know, when you go into the field, we learn about the norms of a culture mostly by making mistakes in that culture.
Yeah, totally.
Do you know?
Totally.
So making mistakes are actually an important part of learning about cultural difference. And if we avoid them, we actually don't interact. And then people witnessing, bystanding, and seeing these really harsh punitive effects of cancel culture are like, well, I can't speak my truth. And then what you have is a space that is not psychologically safe, where people can't make mistakes, where people can't be honest, where people can't actually talk through the complexity of these conflicts. And rather than like, you know, dealing with conflict or managing conflict or sitting with conflict or learning through conflict, we're avoiding conflict and we're being highly risk averse. And I don't think that that's productive. And so, you know, what Tim and I did was we started to kind of unpack that as these sort of armchair philosopher and anthropologist. But what I love is that we actually run a program called You Can't Say That, where we go out into places and we actually get people to really sit with that complexity and that nuance and to make those decisions for themselves, all the while acknowledging their position of power and coming from an empathetic perspective, but a fundamental understanding that you're probably going to get it wrong. That doesn't make you bad. But that conflict and those mistakes, those friction points, they're actually a window that we can use to learn more about ourselves and each other. And it can actually create greater connection and trust because we're not avoiding difference, we're embracing difference. And we're also embracing human fallibility as a part of that.
I love that. Like, Monty, that's just... I feel like you've got your finger on the pulse so well there, because, you know, if we don't put ourselves out there and make those mistakes and learn through those processes, we never know how to create that social capital to build those bridges and to find, you know, our similarities and you know, we can then find humor in those experiences as well. And I'm even thinking, like, you know, to all the watchers and listeners of this series, don't go stealing rocks for plenty of people.
Big thing to take away.
But having
without
said
permission.
that, would that have been such a profound experience for you and such a learning experience of not only the morality of that, but the cultural, you know, the profound cultural learning that you experienced through that moment?
One of the most formative experiences in my life was as a result of a mistake. In fact, I would argue, and this is not the place for all the stories to come out, but pretty much, you know, and I'm at an age where I can afford to reflect on my life and go, like, those mistakes, they're actually really important and I'm glad that I made them, right? But those mistakes are how I've become who I am. You know, we always say, like, the goal is not perfection. Oh my gosh, perfection's actually really dangerous. A lot of the work cultures that we work with, perfectionism, you know, output cultures, they're not conducive to growth. And complexity is not about an end state.
No.
It's about just the next right step and being able to navigate that sort of ethically and equitably and inclusively. And you know, I think, like we always say to people, the point is not perfection. You know, that they ask about, because we run facilitation training and they're like, wow, it's so cool. I'm like, it's actually just anthropology, but and they're like, it's like magic. Well, it's not magic, you know. And this is one of the things when we worked in the men's space. There's a lot of men's work that in that rites of passage space where they become these ritual specialists, and there's a lot of ego attached when they're like sort of suggesting that there's a magical quality to this transformative work, and we demystify it.
Yeah.
And we say it's not magic.
Yeah.
If there is magic, it's the fact that we create a space where people feel safe to be themselves. That's where the magic happens. And so it's not magic, it's just hard work.
Yeah.
And the goal is not perfection. You can't be perfect. You have to be, whenever you're wading into new territory, whenever you're doing new things, whenever you're a leader, you have to be an imposter and you have to make a heap of mistakes along the way. That's how we learn through complexity.
Totally.
So it's not magic, it's just hard work. You just have to care enough to be prepared to make those mistakes and be humble enough to learn from that and keep moving forward.
Do you find that in your research, like these really, really intricate links between your work with toxic masculinity and also, you know, your explorations of cancel culture? You know, I've been thinking a lot recently about when we silence, you know, a voice, whether it's a cis white male voice or whatever it is, we put them into a box and society will silence that voice. And it feels to me that voice only gets louder, but it gets louder in an underground kind of environment. And then it turns into sort of extremism because they were never met with empathy. They were never met with an understanding. This is just me speculating, but do you feel that, like, have you seen that through your work, that if they aren't provided a space, or a safe, facilitated space, you know, something like Habitus or something similar, to be able to find those connections and speak about their stories to other people and find themselves in relation to women and transgender people and everyone else in the world, animals, you know, everything like that, that they find themselves lonely and they've only got themselves to think through their own thoughts with, and then that sort of creates this ostracized sort of antisocial behaviour?
I mean, it sounds like you already know the answer to that question, right? I suppose, you know, I can't remember who said it. I like it. It's a nice metaphor. Children who did not feel the warmth of their village will burn it down to feel the heat. Wow. Yeah, you know that one? And we say, we have this saying, and it is aligned to a psychological perspective. It's Adlerian psychology. We say, you know, resistance is a window into a need not being met. Find the need, meet the need. Yeah. Get curious, not furious. Right? Yeah. And more often than not, what people want is validation and power, but I would say also connection and belonging.
Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, when I work with young men, for example, or you know, people with extreme ideas, it's because they've not got a space to explore, because I have all sorts of really awful ideas. I would argue you do too.
Yeah.
That's part of the human condition.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when we define people only by the bad stuff and we tell them that they're bad, well, at some point they're going to believe it. And that's who they're going to be.
Yeah.
And so, you know, like acknowledging that we have all these different parts of us going through, but not having a space to really unpack that safely without judgment, you know, I think, you know, it creates that alienation and that isolation. And when I think about the young boys, the young men who are moving towards your Jordan Petersons or your Andrew Tates or all those sorts of things, they're lonely. Yeah. They crave connection. They want to know what it's like to be a man, but they don't know who to speak to. And they're constantly, whether it's real or perceived, because I get these dads going, oh, you know, toxic masculinity is such a thing. Boys are ashamed of being boys in schools. I'm like, well, I've spent a bit of time in schools and they're pretty toxic and they're not really being silenced. And that's a perception, but that perception is real. Yeah. And so they perceive, and it's not even all of them, it's only a few of them, but there are a very noisy few of them that can create these really massive effects and really devastating effects on the people that they enact their toxic masculinity onto. But either way, they feel alienated, they feel isolated, and what they crave is connection. And these people like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson are giving them that. Yeah. They're claiming to be these heroes of men, or these saviors of men, that are going to give them the thing that can be known, rather than just teaching them to sit with the complexity, the thing that can be known. Yeah. And you know, when we think about power structures, like what incentive is there for someone in power to challenge the status quo?
Yeah. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So why would we just expect, because I think I'm a pretty decent kind of person, but you know, I'm not giving my house away. Yeah. Even though I believe in equity and redistribution. Yeah. Right? I'm very happy to pay my taxes. Yeah. Yeah. You know, so the point is, like, we're not that different. Yeah. You know, I'm not prepared to give certain things. I mean, I give a lot away through habitus, right? Yeah. But would I place the safety of someone else's child over the safety of my own? I don't think I would. Yeah. Right? Because humans are imperfect. Yeah. We are self-interested. We also have the capacity to be incredibly empathetic and altruistic. And what we do when we put not only silence but put those people in a box is we constrain them, but we reinforce the stuff that is in that box that is incredibly toxic. We need to open that up. Totally. And that can only come through connection. And that's where a lot of the work we do with these young men is about connecting them to healthy mentors, male mentors who can pull apart, who can show them that there are different ways of being, and show them that there's nothing wrong with being tender and sweet and kind and soft.
And you can be both.
And there's nothing wrong with being strong and powerful and aggressive. Yeah. But none of those are necessarily male or female qualities.
No, exactly.
My wife is competitive and aggressive. I like to talk about my emotions. Yeah. So they're just aspects of being a human, and we've attributed a gender to those. Yeah. And so we offer people those opportunities to really unpack them. But those extreme beliefs, they don't. Yeah. They simplify. They provide simple solutions to complex problems. And for some people, that's what they crave. Yeah. And that's why they're so popular. Yeah.
Oh, it's so interesting. It feels like in a world of complexity, we're always trying to search for the simple and how do you dumb that down? And it seems like, you know, like I'm really interested to also hear about this other project that you're working on. I don't know how you find the time, Monty, to do so much incredible work, but you were telling me earlier when we were sitting down to have a cuppa before our interview about this incredible project, citizen ethnography.
So citizen ethnography. Look, I love anthropology. I love ethnography. I want more people to do it, right? And you know, when people talk about, well, how is it that you can be almost predictive? I'm like, well, I've just got skills that I've developed. I've mastered the skills over time. It's a discipline. It's a deep embodied discipline, right? Yeah. And so, you know, I want to. The goal of Habitus is to make anthropology a household name. Yeah. And a big part of that is to help people understand the value of ethnography as the key method and output of anthropological work. But more importantly, it's about destabilising the power dynamic of those authorities of knowledge that come from academic or sort of specialist professional consultants who claim to write the stories of diverse groups, right? Yeah. So as I said, ethnography is fundamentally an ethical project. It's ethical because it's about how we relate to each other, but also who gets to write the stories and how do we write those stories? Whose stories get represented, right? And so, you know, the work around citizen ethnography started to emerge because in my hometown of Kiama, there was, just on the back of COVID, there was a high rate of youth suicide. And it was at a time when there were a whole heap of really well-meaning sort of community members who wanted to fix the problem. Yeah. And they all came to this problem with like project management experience or corporate culture change experience, right? And it was all like, you know, map the systems, identify the stakeholders, identify the problem, create a course of action, fix the problem, there we go, right? Yeah. And not once did they speak to a young person. Yeah. And because I'd had these relationships with young people through the work I'd done in the schools and in the community, they were sort of saying, look, these grown-ups keep co-opting the narrative, right? They didn't quite say those words. Yeah. I can't say the words that they told me. But they basically said, look, what's happening right now is that grown-ups are telling us what to do. And what we do not need is another dude in a room with a PowerPoint presentation telling us about mental health first aid. Yeah. We're actually pretty savvy when it comes to this sort of stuff. And what was happening was that these young people wanted to understand the experience. And they wanted to understand the experience on their terms. And so we were like, well, how can we do this? So we decided to create a series of programs with them where we were able to create a space where they can safely share their stories, unpack the complexity of that experience, and engage in a process of collective sense-making of that complex experience. And on the basis of that, we were able to draw down a whole heap of data points that they were then able to use, and we supported them, we trained and supported them to actually process, synthesize and analyze those data points to turn them into community change projects where we supported them for a couple of terms where they were able to identify what do we really want to change, and then they actually made those programs for themselves. And then they took all the data from all of that and they turned that into this amazing white paper. It's incredible because the white paper was written in their words. Yeah. And then when we presented that back to the community was like, wow, we finally get it. Right? Actually, we never had the answers. And it wasn't about trying to fix the problem, because they kept saying the problem was mental health and suicide and substance use and violence. And same thing with the pania, right? Maybe they were the symptoms of a deeper problem. And so, rather than trying to fix the problem, let's try and understand the situation, right? Because when you go to a young person and you say, we need to fix you, you are starting from a position that assumes that they're already broken. Yeah. And there's no strength-based approach in that. And so what these young people, and the insights, oh my gosh, I would really love if you, when you put this out there, to give a link to the white paper that they wrote. But the insights were things like, we know you made mistakes to their parents, right? Yeah. We know you made mistakes. That's how you became who you were. But you're trying to protect us from making mistakes. Yep. You're trying to actually protect us from living our lives, and we actually need to be prepared to live our lives. This community is amazing, but it is incredibly, it's monocultural. It's the gender norms are really restrictive. There is no place for diversity. And if you're different and you don't fit in, then it's excruciating. And he said, we need a space where we can be different, we can explore ourselves, where we can make mistakes. They said, stuffing up is not the worst thing that could happen. Giving up is. Yeah. And every time we come to you and we tell you something and you give us your opinion, you're basically shutting down our experience and telling us that our experience is not good enough or not right. Every time we tell you we want to do something like my son wants to be a chef, and I'm incredibly proud of him, because he loves it. He wants to do it. Yeah. Whereas if I was of that ilk where I was like, oh no, but you have to be an anthropologist, what kind of life would that be for him, right? Yeah, totally. What kind of pressure would that be at a time when there's already so much pressure? Yeah. And so, we were able to take that experience and reproduce it in a range of different spaces. We delivered a video and a paper at the EPIC conference in 2021. We've now been taken up by a number of different organisations to run citizen ethnography, which is essentially this idea, like citizen science, is to distribute ethnographic processing power, much like the stones, right? Yeah. We can collect, process, store, recall vast amounts of information because of our relationships and our environment. We teach people how to see culture like that. Yeah. And in doing so, we teach them how to read aspects of their experience. But more importantly, we create spaces where they realise that the most valuable resource is them and their stories. Yeah. And if they can get into a place where they can share those stories, they don't have to agree on what it means. Yeah. And in fact, the contestation of, I think it means this, I think it means that, is part of the triangulation process where we get some truth. Yep, and we get them to decide, well, what is the story that is being told here? What is the story that you want to tell? What is the story that needs to be told? And engage them in this realisation that there is never just one story, that it is always being told. And so the idea here is like citizen science, where, the members of the community are the ones who are doing the processing. We want to distribute that out to the ethnographic power out to members of the community. And we've found it to be an incredible tool. Where I'm going to in Brisbane it's coming to the end of a sort of a 12-month project where we've been working with people in the lived experience workers in the mental health and suicidality space. Yeah. And those people have become incredibly exploited and almost marginalised. Even though everybody says you have to have lived experience workers in this work, they tend to not have a say. Their stories tend to be co-opted or colonised by the organisations, not from bad faith. They actually mean well, but it's because of bad practice.
Yeah.
And so the whole idea of this project was to help them take their stories back, but to help them realise that they are the resource, and to support them with the tools to be able to collectively make sense of that experience together. And we ran, similar kind of projects, but we added this 12-week ethnography course, and they took to it like ducks to water, because ethnography is all about the lived experience.
Yeah.
And so now, with no intervention, they've written their own white paper, and I'm going up there. I was originally going to go up there to teach them about storytelling, but I'm going to go up there and they're going to teach me.
Yeah, you
as
guys
it turns out,
stage,
which is exactly where we want to be.
Yeah, totally.
Where it is less about dependency on the authority of knowledge, or the professional expertise of the ethnographer, but really helping people formalise what humans are always doing, which is watching, observing, questioning, asking, philosophising, assessing, analysing, and making sense of their experience. Yeah. But providing them with the tools of ethnography, which has a deep ethical foundation to mitigate the risks of power structures and inequity, to support them to do it well. And I'm telling you now, they're incredible.
Yeah, that sounds
Absolutely.
So fascinating. It sounds like such an interesting model and case study for how to foster civic discourse in a world that is so crying out for it right now.
100%.
So as a final question, Monty, I love asking fellow anthros this one. What role and future opportunities and challenges do you see for anthropology in the future?
Gee, that's a big set of questions to finish off on.
Just a tiny one.
What role, what possibilities, what challenges? Look, I think I start from the premise that humans are all lay anthropologists to begin with. Yeah. That's why the work that we do is so easily accessible in all those different spaces. People want to know what it means to be human.
Yep.
And we support them with really good mechanisms and methods to do that. We connect them to the long story of what it means to be human over evolutionary time. And we also connect them to the diverse stories in a cross-cultural context. We're able to kind of look at brains, bodies, behaviours, and how they all intersect with culture. Yeah. How, I love the fact that I don't get caught up in the nature-nurture question, because I see them as an anthropologist as something that is co-evolved.
Yep.
You can't separate them. So I think it's a pointless question, right? And what that does is it reinvigorates the power of the things that we think, they're not that important because they're not physical. They're actually deeply important when we think about our lives. And when we think about that sense of belonging and when we die, at the moment of our death, the stuff that we think about is not the biological facts of essentialist masculinity or essentialist race. It's our relationships. Yeah. It's our connections. It's our stories, the meaning that we drew from that. And so I think humans are lay anthropologists. And so, when I think about the role of anthropology, I think I want to situate it globally and locally. So globally, I think the world has started to really embrace it. Yeah. Red Associates in Northern Europe are taking on the big banks. They've helped Lego to reassert itself in an age of, computer technology, for example. You've got organisations drawing on ethnographic perspectives to deal with big problems. The Kinevin Centre and the Sensemaker programs of Dave Snowden, dealing with big, thick, chunky problems, right? Using data to centre human stories and connect stories to numbers. These things are being used in the military, in the government, in disaster. The fact that the military is actually actively employing anthropologists to deal with its wicked problems. The fact that Microsoft is the biggest employer of anthropologists. It speaks to the fact we have a place.
Yep.
The issue is that people don't recognise what that place is, or they don't recognise that anthropologists are doing those jobs.
Yeah.
And so, I think that there's a lot of closeted anthropologists who are too afraid to actually come out and say, I'm an anthropologist. Because I lead with that.
Yeah.
They come out and they say, I'm a design thinker, I'm a strategic analyst, I'm a, whatever it is, right? Or UX designer. You're an anthropologist and be proud of it.
Yeah,
because we bring something really special to this field. And I think that thinking about the global trends, Australia has the potential to be on that wave.
Yep.
It's about to hit. right? And we have a choice about what role we want to play in that. Do we want to give it over to people that don't really understand it? Or do we want to actually have a significant role in it? It's coming. Do we want to have a significant role in this push towards a more human-centred way of doing things? Especially in the age of technology, and especially in the age of division, where people are like, this is not enough, right? Where we're challenging big systems and structures that no longer serve us, right? Whether it be in leadership, whether it be in governance, whether it be in the way that we find meaning in our lives, right? Returning to a human-centred approach is it's happening. So I think, globally, I think we're doing okay. Gillian Tett's book has been picked up by so many people. Locally, we've got a long way to go. I think that's the role that Habitus, I want Habitus to play, is to really to shine a light on that, to create a place where an undergraduate in anthropology, or an honours student, or a PhD or a master's student goes, where can I work? And I'll be like, come and work at Habitus. Right?
Yes.
And if you don't want to come and work at Habitus, use us as a model, create your own business. And do your own amazing stuff out there in the world. And so I think that's what I want Habitus to be. I want it to be a place where people see the word anthropology leading from the front, to make it a household name, so that people don't have to hide who they are. A big part of that is to introduce the concepts earlier. I think globally, it's important that we continue this work, but I want it to operate on a local level. I know that every person I've interacted with now knows the word anthropology, now understands culture a bit differently, now understands that, telling stories, playing games, sitting with people, understanding people is a thing, that it's not just a fanciful thing that you can do. It can actually, there's a living that you can make out of it, but more importantly, you can make a difference through this living.
Totally.
And so when a kid goes like, what's that thing you do when you learn about where people came from? Anthropology. What's that thing you do when you want to learn about different cultures? It's anthropology. What's that thing you do if you want to learn about organizational cultures? It's anthropology. How do we understand where change comes from, where mobilization comes from? That's anthropology. And I think one of the major challenges at the moment is still that unfortunate divide between the academic and the applied. I would like to try and straddle those two worlds, but it's actually really difficult. And I think that we as anthropology in Australia really needs to do a lot more to support the graduates of anthropology, to feel proud about what they're doing when they're not doing it in academia, and to really support those people to have meaningful careers outside of academia, and really celebrate them, rather than thinking that it is taking away from the orthodoxy of the academic discipline.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks so much, Monty, for meeting with me today. I feel like we just scratched the surface of your incredibly vibrant career, and you just bring so much joy to everyday conversations, and I feel like you bring a lot of joy to the discipline. So it's been a real honour, and I'm so excited to see the growth of Habitus into the future, and to learn more about the Citizen Ethnography project. It sounds fascinating.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the opportunity.